December 20th, 2024. The Federal Reserve disseminates its most recent monetary supply statistics. M2, the most expensive gauge of circulating currency, totals 21.2 trillion. For reference, in January of 2020, preceding the pandemic, M2 was 15.4 trillion. In less than 5 years, the United States has generated 5.8 trillion in new currency. This represents a 38% expansion in the money supply in under 5 years. To illustrate, the entire U.S. money supply in 1980 was 1.66 trillion. We have issued an amount equivalent to 3.6 times the entire 1980 economy in merely 5 years. However, here is what is being withheld from public knowledge. The inflationary surge has yet to fully materialize, not the genuine inflation. What we endured in 2021, 2023, the official 9% inflation rate, the 20% actual inflation for groceries and rent. That was merely an introduction. The primary event is imminent because 5.8 trillion does not vanish from the economy instantaneously. It propagates in cycles. The initial cycle impacted asset valuations. Stocks have risen 60% since 2020. Real estate has increased 47%. The subsequent cycle affected consumer prices, encompassing groceries, fuel, and rent. The third cycle, the one that devastates the middle class, is still developing. And this is not solely attributable to the 5.8 trillion already created. It also accounts for the 90 trillion projected to be generated over the ensuing 15 years to service the debt accumulated. This is the debt-driven inflation spiral. Once initiated, it continues unabated until the currency is invalidated and the middle class is annihilated. Here is a critical disclosure that no government official will provide. There is no feasible strategy for liquidating the 36 trillion national debt. Absolutely none. The arithmetic is insurmountable. The sole avenue for resolution lies in inflation. Massive sustained inflation that erodes the middle class, facilitating the transfer of 20 to 30 trillion in wealth from savers and wage earners to asset owners and the government over the next decade. This is not conjecture. This is pattern recognition. This is the predictable outcome whenever a government resorts to printing money to finance insurmountable debt. The Roman Empire experienced this. Weimar Germany underwent this. Richard Nixon initiated this, albeit at a slower pace. And America is currently navigating this trajectory at an accelerated rate compared to any historical precedent. Presented here is the complete four-stage framework of currency devaluation. 3 historical instances conclusively demonstrate its inevitability, an exact temporal analysis delineating our current position within this cycle, the mathematical substantiation proving the government's inability to avoid inflation, and the identification of those who will suffer losses versus those who will accumulate wealth during a currency crisis. Because this transcends mere economics. This is a matter of survival, and if one fails to comprehend the impending events, they will find themselves on the losing side of the most significant wealth redistribution in American history. Every instance of currency collapse throughout history adheres to the same 4 fundamental stages, without exception across 2 millennia. Stage 1. The bedrock. A nation establishes a reliable currency, underpinned by tangible assets such as gold, silver, or commodities. This backing fosters trust. Trust, in turn, fuels economic expansion. Individuals entrust their savings to the currency, confident in its enduring value. This phase typically spans decades, if not centuries. Stage 2. The gradual erosion. A government confronts escalating expenditures, often stemming from conflicts, extensive social programs, imperial overreach, or illicit payments necessary to retain authority. Tax revenues prove insufficient. Borrowing capacity reaches its limits. Consequently, governments resort to a predictable course of action. They begin to debase the currency. This involves diminishing the precious metal content or increasing the volume of paper currency issued. Assurances are made that these measures are temporary and that the fundamental stability remains unaltered. Stage 3. The loss of control. The debasement intensifies, inflation escalates, and the currency begins to collapse. Crucially, the middle class, whose wealth is held in the devalued currency, is decimated. Conversely, those closely connected to the creation of money, the elites, landowners, and politically influential individuals, weather the storm. They consolidate their assets, acquiring properties from desperate sellers at significantly reduced prices. Stage 4. The recalibration. A new currency is introduced. Wealth has been irrevocably transferred from millions to a select few thousand. The system is re-established, and those who have lost everything remain unaware of the unfolding process as each stage seamlessly transitions into the next. Let me substantiate this pattern using 3 distinct civilizations spanning 2,000 years. Historical precedent: Rome, spanning from 64 AD to 270 AD. In 64 AD, Rome was engulfed in flames. Emperor Nero urgently required funds. The denarius, Rome's silver coin, which had previously contained 95% pure silver under Emperor Augustus, was reduced by Nero to 80% purity. This marked the commencement of Stage 2. Most Roman citizens remained oblivious. The coin retained its appearance and transactional value, yet it contained 15% less silver. Nero proceeded to mint more coins with this diminished silver content. With an increased money supply and an unchanged availability of goods, prices began to rise. 130 years later, under Emperor Septimius Severus, the very same denarius contained merely 46% silver, comprising equal parts silver and base metal. Subsequently, under Caracalla, in 215 AD, he introduced the Antoninianus, nominally valued at 2 denarii, but containing only 1.5 times the silver content. This constituted monetary fraud on a civilizational scale. By 253 AD, under Emperor Gallienus, the Antoninianus contained only 20% silver. A decade later, this figure plummeted to 2%. 2% silver in what was once the world's most trusted currency. What became of prices? They skyrocketed, experiencing 1,000% increase over a 100-year period. A measure of wheat that cost 100 denarii in 150 AD escalated to 100,000 denarii by 250 AD. Who suffered losses? The Roman middle class. Small landowners, merchants, and soldiers on fixed wages. Anyone holding denarii as savings witnessed their wealth evaporate. A merchant who had diligently saved 100,000 denarii throughout his lifetime, sufficient to purchase a farm, found it was only enough to buy a single loaf of bread. Who profited? Large landowners, senators with extensive estates, individuals holding tangible assets such as land, buildings, and livestock experienced their value appreciate in terms of the debased currency. A farm valued at 100,000 denarii in 150 AD was worth 100 million denarii by 250 AD. The land remained unchanged, the currency was devalued. The consequence was the consolidation of wealth within the senatorial class. The middle class was systematically dismantled. By 300 AD, Rome had transformed from a republic with a substantial middle class into an oligarchy, where a few hundred families controlled the majority of the empire's assets. This debasement had irrevocably undermined Rome's social fabric, and within 200 years the Western Roman Empire had collapsed. Observe the 4 stages. Stage 1, the establishment of a trusted silver currency under Augustus. Stage 2, over 200 years of progressive debasement to finance wars and imperial expansion. Stage 3, hyper-debasement and 1,000% inflation, leading to the annihilation of the middle class. Stage 4, currency reform under Diocletian, accompanied by wealth concentration among the elite and a weakened empire beyond repair. The pattern is complete. Weimar Germany, 1921 to 1923. Following the First World War, Germany was obligated to pay 132 billion gold marks in reparations, equivalent to approximately $442 billion today. Germany had abandoned the gold standard during the war and was now required to settle its debts in gold-backed currency, possessing very little. The Weimar government faced a critical decision. Instead of raising taxes or implementing austerity measures, both politically unfeasible options, they resorted to printing money. Observe the precipitous acceleration of this process. January 1919, 8.9 marks per US dollar, a normal post-war valuation. July 1922, 493 marks per dollar. January 1923, 17,972 marks per dollar. Following the French occupation of the Rouen region, August 1923 saw the exchange rate reach 4.6 million marks per dollar. By November 1923, it had surged to 4.2 trillion marks per dollar. A single loaf of bread that cost 160 marks at the close of 1922 demanded 200 billion marks by November 1923. Families who had diligently saved for generations witnessed their entire fortunes vanish within months. A middle-class family possessing 100,000 marks in savings in 1922, sufficient for 5 years of comfortable living, could not afford a postage stamp by December 1923. However, those who held tangible assets fared considerably better. Farmers owned land that yielded crops. Factory owners possessed buildings and machinery. Anyone who had incurred debt denominated in marks saw their obligations effectively erased by inflation. If you borrowed 100,000 marks in 1921 to purchase a home, by 1923 you owed 100,000 marks, which was equivalent to 1/1,000,000th of a loaf of bread. Your debt was extinguished. Your home was yours, entirely unencumbered. The hyperinflation orchestrated the most substantial wealth transfer in German history, moving wealth from the middle-class savers to asset holders and debtors. Who suffered the consequences? Teachers, civil servants, pensioners, anyone reliant on fixed incomes or holding cash savings. The professional middle class was systematically decimated. Who emerged victorious? Industrialists like Hugo Steiners, who had leveraged heavily to acquire assets during the inflationary period, subsequently repaying their loans with worthless marks. Large landowners, speculators who accurately predicted the unfolding events. The psychological trauma resulting from this period profoundly shaped German politics for the subsequent decade. The middle class felt profoundly betrayed. They had exercised thrift, adhered to established rules, and placed their trust in the government, only to be ruined. And a struggling artist named Adolf Hitler leveraged their outrage to build a formidable political movement. Applying the pattern, Stage 1, a gold-backed mark preceding World War I, Stage 2, currency expansion during World War I, and subsequent printing to meet reparation payments, 1921 to 1923. Stage 3, a staggering 209,500% monthly inflation in October 1923, resulting in the complete destruction of the middle class. Stage 4, the introduction of the Rentenmark in November 1923, leading to wealth consolidation and Hitler's rise to power within 10 years. The pattern is demonstrably repeating. Undeniable. Nixon and the dollar, 1971 to the present. On August 15, 1971, President Nixon addressed the nation on television and announced the suspension of the dollar's convertibility into gold, an event known as the Nixon shock. For 27 years since the Bretton Woods Agreement in 1944, the dollar had been pegged to gold at $35 per ounce. All other major currencies were pegged to the dollar, forming the bedrock of the global financial system. However, by 1971, America was experiencing a significant outflow of gold. Foreign governments were demanding redemption. The United States possessed only 10,000 metric tons of gold, remaining less than half of its peak reserves. On August 11, 1971, Great Britain requested the transfer of $3 billion in gold from Fort Knox. Nixon could not fulfill this request without revealing that the U.S. lacked sufficient gold reserves. On August 15th, he unilaterally closed the gold window. The dollar instantly transformed into a purely fiat currency. Within 15 months, the entire Bretton Woods system had collapsed. The dollar began to float against other currencies, and America discovered it could print unlimited amounts of money without the constraint of gold backing. What followed? Inflation. The 1970s ushered in a period of stagflation, characterized by a 6% unemployment rate and a soaring inflation rate of 13.5% by 1980. Those holding dollars witnessed a substantial erosion of their purchasing power. Conversely, asset holders experienced significant gains. Real estate values surged. Gold, which traded at $35 per ounce in 1971, reached $850 per ounce by 1980, a 24-fold increase in 9 years. Stock markets recovered after the initial shock. Individuals who invested in real estate, commodities, or equities during the 1970s amassed generational wealth. The wealth disparity began to widen systematically. In 1971, the top 1% held 23% of national wealth. By 1990, this figure had risen to 30%. As of 2024, it stands at 32%. The transition from a gold-backed currency to a pure fiat system enabled unlimited money printing, disproportionately benefiting asset holders. Examining the pattern. Stage 1. The gold-backed dollar established under Bretton Woods in 1944. Stage 2. Decades of deficit spending and monetary expansion depleted gold reserves, leading to forced debasement in 1971. Stage 3. 1970s inflation decimated savings, and the wealth gap widened. Stage 4. We are currently experiencing this stage, the fiat currency system, with wealth inequality at unprecedented levels. We are in Stage 3, transitioning towards Stage 4, and the acceleration is imminent. The present crisis in America, 2024, falls under Stage 3, with accelerating trends. Let me illustrate America's current position within the 4-stage framework. Stage 1. Complete. America established the gold-backed dollar as the world's reserve currency in 1944. Verified. Stage 2. Complete. Decades of deficit spending and monetary expansion followed, culminating in the closure of the gold window in 1971 and the unleashing of pure fiat currency. The national debt escalated from $398 billion in 1971 to $36.2 trillion by December 2024, representing a 91-fold increase over 53 years. Verified. Stage 3. In progress. Currency devaluation is accelerating, and wealth concentration is intensifying. Let me present the current figures. M2 money supply. December 2024, $21.2 trillion. January 2020, $15.4 trillion. An increase of $5.8 trillion in under 5 years, equating to a 38% expansion. However, this is not solely about the money already printed. It encompasses what must be printed moving forward. National debt. December 2024, $36.2 trillion. Annual deficit in 2024, $1.9 trillion. Projected deficit for 2025, $2.1 trillion. Interest payments on the debt, $1.13 trillion in fiscal year 2024. This equates to $130 billion in interest alone. For context, this amount exceeds the entire defense budget of $880 billion. This is where the downward spiral commences. Interest payments have become the second largest federal expenditure, trailing only Social Security. As the national debt grows, so do interest payments. These interest payments are added to the deficit, which further increases the debt, subsequently driving up interest payments. The Congressional Budget Office projects that by 2034, interest payments will reach $1.7 trillion annually. By 2040, this figure is expected to be $2.4 trillion, assuming an average interest rate of 3.5%. However, current 10-year Treasury rates stand at 4.4%. If rates remain at 4.4%, interest payments will reach $2 trillion by 2030 and $3 trillion by 2035. Herein lies the predicament. Total federal revenue in 2024 was $4.9 trillion. Total federal spending amounted to $6.8 trillion. Mandatory spending, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, along with interest payments, totaled $4.2 trillion. By 2034, the CBO projects that mandatory spending alone will reach $6.5 trillion. This figure surpasses today's total federal revenue. There will be no funds remaining for defense, education, infrastructure, or veterans programs. Nothing. only mandatory payments will be covered. The government possesses three potential courses of action. Option 1. Reduce spending. This is politically unfeasible. It would necessitate cuts to Social Security and Medicare, which are considered sacrosanct. Even if the entire defense budget and all discretionary spending were eliminated, leaving only mandatory programs, a deficit would still persist due to escalating interest payments. Option 2. Increase taxes. This would require a 40% across-the-board tax hike to balance the budget. Consequently, an average family earning $75,000 would face an additional $9,000 in annual taxes. This level of political risk is insurmountable and will not occur. Option 3. Print money. This is the only viable recourse. The Federal Reserve will acquire treasury bonds by generating new currency. This is known as debt monetization. This process directly leads to inflation, and it is already underway. The Federal Reserve's balance sheet, which peaked at $9 trillion in 2022, currently stands at $7.4 trillion. While the Fed claims to be reducing its balance sheet, it still holds $4.8 trillion in Treasury securities. As deficits escalate and foreign buyers decrease their purchases of treasuries, China has reduced holdings by $350 billion from its peak, and Japan by $180 billion. The Federal Reserve will be compelled to increase its acquisitions. This necessitates the creation of money to purchase government debt, which serves as the inflationary mechanism. This is not a theoretical scenario, it is an ongoing reality. This outlines the forthcoming inflation timeline. Let me illustrate the projected progression of these events. 2020 to 2024. The preparatory phase. $5.8 trillion in new currency has been printed. The initial wave has impacted asset values, with stocks and housing appreciating by 4 to 6%. The subsequent wave has affected consumer prices, with official CPI registering a 20% cumulative increase and real inflation for essential goods reaching 30 to 40%. This represents the prelude. 2025 to 2027. The deficit explosion. Annual deficits will consistently surpass $2 trillion. Interest payments will approach $1.5 trillion. Foreign purchases of Treasury securities will continue to decline. The Federal Reserve will be compelled to increase its Treasury purchases from $200 billion annually to $500 billion annually. The M2 money supply will grow by $2 trillion, expanding from $21 trillion to $23 trillion by the end of 2027. 2028 to 2030. The acceleration phase. Interest payments will reach $2 trillion annually, representing 40% of tax revenue solely dedicated to interest. Deficits will rise to $2.5 to $3 trillion. The Federal Reserve will be purchasing $800 billion in treasuries annually. The M2 money supply will reach $26 trillion by 2030. This signifies a 69% cumulative increase in the money supply since 2020. Real inflation, distinct from CPI, will average 8 to 12% annually. Wages will increase by 3 to 4%. The middle class will experience a loss of 5 to 8% in purchasing power annually. 2031 to 2033. The crisis point. The Social Security Trust Fund is projected to be depleted by 2033, leading to an automatic 21% reduction in benefits unless Congress intervenes. Congress is unlikely to implement benefit cuts prior to an election. Thus, they will likely resolve the shortfall by printing money. The Medicare Trust Fund is projected to be depleted between 2028 and 2031, contingent on usage patterns. The same solution will likely be employed, printing money. Collectively, these shortfalls will necessitate an additional $500 billion or more in annual spending without corresponding revenue increases. The Federal Reserve will be purchasing $1.5 trillion in treasuries annually. The M2 money supply will approach $30 trillion. Real inflation will range from 12 to 18% annually. 2034 to 2040. The period of destruction. Interest payments will consume over 50% of tax revenue. the Federal Reserve will hold over 40% of all outstanding Treasury securities. The dollar will experience a significant loss of its reserve currency status as other nations divest from Treasury holdings. Inflation will persist at 10 to 15% annually. Cumulative inflation since 2020 will range from 300 to 400%. A house that cost $400,000 in 2020 will cost $1.6 million by 2040. Wages will not keep pace. The middle class, with a median net worth of $200,000 in 2020, will have experienced a 60% reduction in real purchasing power. This is not speculative forecasting. It is a mathematical certainty. The national debt mandates interest payments that will outpace revenue growth. The sole recourse for addressing this is money printing. Money printing engenders inflation. Inflation necessitates further money printing to service the debt. This constitutes a self-perpetuating cycle that will only cease with either debt restructuring, default, or complete inflation-driven currency devaluation. Currency destruction. Who faces annihilation and who consolidates wealth? Let me precisely delineate who will incur losses and who will profit as inflation escalates. The middle class, wage earners, and savers will be destroyed. The median American household possesses a net worth of $200,000 as of 2024, with 65% attributed to home equity. When real inflation consistently averages 10% annually for a decade, assets will diminish in purchasing power at varying rates. Your home, which may nominally increase in value from $400,000 to $700,000 by 2034, will have a real purchasing power of only $270,000 in 2024 dollars. You will not have gained wealth, you will have lost 33% in real terms. Your retirement account, nominally growing from $200,000 to $350,000 by 2034 at a 7% annual return, will have a real purchasing power of only $135,000 in 2024 dollars. You will have lost 33% in real terms. Your wages increasing from $75,000 to $110,000 by 2034 at a 3% annual raise will have a real purchasing power of only $42,000 in 2024 dollars. You will have suffered a 44% reduction in real income. Your total net worth, nominally rising from $200,000 to $360,000, will have a real purchasing power of only $138,000 in 2024 dollars. You will have lost 31% of your wealth while erroneously believing you are becoming wealthier due to the larger nominal figures. This is the inflationary trap. Nominal values escalate while real purchasing power declines, and most individuals fail to grasp the distinction until they attempt to retire and realize their $350,000 in retirement savings can purchase only what $135,000 could a decade prior. Specifically, who will be annihilated? Retirees relying on fixed pensions, savers holding cash or bonds. $100,000 in a savings account or treasury bonds will lose 60% of its purchasing power over 10 years. Young workers starting with a $50,000 salary in 2024 will see that value diminish to $19,000 in real terms by 2034. Saving for a home will become impossible as income will not keep pace with asset price inflation. Public sector workers, government employees subject to wage caps will experience a 40 to 50% decline in real income. The middle class, broadly defined as households with incomes between $50,000 and $200,000, will be effectively impoverished by sustained 10% real inflation over a decade. The consolidators, asset holders, and debt holders. Now let me illustrate who will profit. The top 1% of households possess a median net worth of $11.6 million as of 2024. Their wealth composition consists of 80% in stocks and real estate, 15% in business equity, and 5% in bonds and cash. Their stock holdings will appreciate in lockstep with inflation. The S&P 500 tracks nominal GDP growth. If nominal GDP grows at 12% annually, comprising 3% real growth and 9% inflation, stocks will exhibit similar appreciation. $5 million in stocks will grow to $15.5 million over 10 years. In nominal terms, the real purchasing power will be $6 million in 2024 dollars. They will have gained wealth. Their real estate holdings will appreciate in tandem with inflation. $3 million in real estate will increase to $7.8 million nominally. The real purchasing power will remain $3 million, representing no loss, but rather protection against inflation. Their business equity will grow proportionally with inflation as revenues nominally increase. Furthermore, if they hold debt, inflation will effectively eliminate it. A $2 million mortgage taken out in 2024 will still require a $2 million repayment in 2034, but its real burden will be only $770,000 in 2024 dollars. Their debt will have evaporated. Specifically, who will consolidate wealth? Large asset holders. Individuals possessing over $5 million in investments, encompassing both stocks and real estate, witness their fortunes either maintained or enhanced in real terms. Corporations endowed with pricing power, that is, entities capable of escalating their prices at a pace exceeding their cost. Increases invariably generate extraordinary profits. Consider prominent examples like Apple, Microsoft, major energy conglomerates, and astute real estate investors. Furthermore, proprietors of rental properties routinely adjust their rents in alignment with inflation, thereby securing consistent income streams and effectively diminishing the real burden of their mortgage obligations through currency devaluation. Even governmental entities themselves benefit. The sum of $36 trillion, when measured in the year 24, effectively diminishes to $14 trillion by the year 34, representing a decade of 10% annual inflation. This debt effectively evaporates through the debasement of the currency. This very process constitutes the mechanism by which wealth is redistributed. Inflation orchestrates a transfer of value from those who hold liquid cash, depend on wages, or possess bonds, to those who own equities, real property, and outstanding debts. The movement is from the vast majority to an exclusive few, from the broader middle stratum of society to the top 1%. The mathematical underpinnings of this phenomenon are inescapable. Allow me to elucidate the reasons behind this inevitable mathematical progression. The aggregate debt of the United States, encompassing governmental, household, and corporate liabilities, stood at $90 trillion as of December of the year 24. The annual gross domestic product for that same year was $28 trillion, resulting in a debt-to-GDP ratio of 321%. Examining historical patterns, when the debt-to-GDP ratio surpasses 250%, nations typically face a stark choice: either default on their obligations or resort to inflationary measures. Given the United States' global standing, a default would represent political suicide and trigger a worldwide economic collapse. Therefore, the path of inflation becomes the prescribed course. To reduce the debt-to-GDP ratio from 321% to a more sustainable 150%, two primary avenues exist. Either expand the GDP while keeping debt constant, which is practically impossible as debt escalates by $2 trillion annually, or repay the debt at a rate faster than GDP growth, an equally unattainable feat requiring annual surpluses exceeding $3 trillion. Consequently, the sole viable strategy involves inflating nominal GDP while concurrently shrinking the real debt burden through inflationary pressures. If an annual inflation rate of 10% is sustained for a decade, with real GDP experiencing a consistent 2% growth, the nominal GDP would surge from $28 trillion to $73 trillion. Concurrently, if the national debt grows nominally from $90 trillion to $130 trillion, factoring in an annual increase of $4 trillion, the debt-to-GDP ratio would subsequently fall to 178%, effectively resolving the debt crisis through inflation. However, this solution comes at a profound cost: the decimation of the middle class. This presents a stark dichotomy, a choice between immediate, catastrophic collapse through default or a prolonged slow-motion collapse over a period of 10 to 15 years via inflation. Governments invariably opt for inflation, as it is a politically survivable strategy, often misunderstood by the electorate, whereas a default precipitates an immediate crisis. Stage 4 heralds the reset. What transpires in the aftermath of sustained inflation? History suggests three potential outcomes. The first possibility involves currency replacement. The dollar could relinquish its reserve currency status, paving the way for a new international medium of exchange, perhaps backed by gold, based on special drawing rights, or utilizing a basket of currencies. While the dollar might persist domestically, its value would be significantly diminished. This is characterized as a soft landing, yet it entails a permanent loss of 50 to 70% of Americans' purchasing power. The second scenario is hyperinflation. Should the Federal Reserve lose control during the critical period between 28 and 33, inflation could spiral from 10% to 20, then 40, and eventually to extreme levels, rendering the currency worthless and necessitating the introduction of a new dollar. This represents a hard crash. The third possibility is financial repression. The government might institute capital controls, compel pension funds, and financial institutions to acquire treasury bonds at artificially suppressed interest rates, and impose price ceilings on essential goods. This constitutes a gradual confiscation, wherein savers see their wealth eroded by negative real interest rates. This is the authoritarian path. Though a combination of these outcomes is most probable, sustained high inflation, ranging from 8 to 15% annually for a decade, or 15 years, would reduce the debt burden while simultaneously depleting the savings of the middle class. The currency would partially forfeit its global reserve status, and the government would implement some form of capital controls. The dollar would endure, but by the year 2040, its purchasing power would be reduced to 30 to 40% of its current value. The complete reset is anticipated by 2040. Wealth will have been redistributed. The median net worth of the middle class, standing at $200,000 in 24, would translate to $140,000 in real purchasing power. Conversely, the wealthiest 1%, possessing $11.6 million, would see their holdings expand to $12 to $15 million in real terms, having benefited from wealth appreciation driven by inflation. This cycle concludes with millions experiencing losses and thousands consolidating wealth, followed by a currency reset. History, in essence, repeats itself. As of December of the year 25, we stand at a critical juncture. The $5.8 trillion already injected into the economy is now circulating. The impending $90 trillion in inflation over 15 years is the unavoidable mathematical consequence of unserviceable debt, payable only through currency debasement. The middle class is on the precipice of annihilation, not through a sudden cataclysm, but through a relentless, sustained inflation that erodes purchasing power by 5 to 10% annually for a decade. You will observe your salary increase yet feel progressively poorer each year. Your home's value may double, only for you to discover that you cannot afford to relocate due to a tripling in the price of new residences. This pattern has been replicated for 2 millennia. Rome engaged in currency debasement for 2 centuries, dismantling its middle class. Weimar Germany printed money for 2 years, annihilating its savers. Nixon severed the dollar's gold backing in 1971, initiating 53 years of slow-motion debasement that has now accelerated into a full-blown crisis. America is presently following this identical trajectory. Stage 1 is complete, Stage 2 is complete, Stage 3 is underway, and Stage 4 is imminent. If this exposition has demonstrated that the projected $90 trillion in inflation is a mathematical certainty, if you comprehend the 4-stage historical pattern that has led to the demise of every currency, and if you recognize that the middle class is poised for annihilation while asset holders consolidate wealth, then subscribe. The subsequent video will outline 3 concrete actions you can implement immediately to position yourself advantageously during this wealth transfer. It will detail how to convert vulnerable assets into inflation-resistant ones, how to strategically leverage debt in the manner of the 1%, and why the upcoming 3 years, from 25 to 27, represent the final opportunity to prepare before acceleration renders it too late. The projected $90 trillion in inflation is not an impending event. It is already in motion. The initial $5.8 trillion has been issued. An additional $15 trillion is slated for issuance by 2030. By 2040, we will have effectively inflated away a $90 trillion real debt burden by systematically destroying the currency and, consequently, the middle class. The historical pattern is irrefutable. The mathematical principles are undeniable, and the middle class, reliant on cash and wages, invariably suffers ruin. Debt that cannot be repaid is never truly paid. It is merely inflated away, and you are currently holding the currency designated for sacrifice to extinguish that debt.